Director of the Energy Systems Integration Group. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information and resources for renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We also provide peer-to-peer networking opportunities, information and knowledge sharing, and professional educational experiences. Our most recent activity was our Fall Technical Workshop in Charlotte in October. Our next activity will be the Spring Technical Workshop in Tucson in March, followed by our International ESI Workshop with the AEMO in Australia in April. There's still plenty of time to register and make plans to attend. These workshops deal with a full range of issues associated with integrating wind and solar into electric, gas, and thermal systems. They also deal with a coupling to energy-consuming infrastructures, especially electric transportation, buildings, and industry. Information is available on the website on the upcoming workshop schedule for the year, and all are welcome. ESIG is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find us at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. So please use the question and answer box on the lower right side of your screen, not the chat box, to submit questions. And we should have at least 15 minutes, maybe more at the end for the Q&A. And I'll ask you to please be sure to send the questions to all panelists, not just the host or the presenter, or I may not see them. So remember, all panelists. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so don't be afraid to use the Q&A box. All right, so today our webinar is on the topic of voltage regulation with smart inverters. Based on registrations, it looks like this should be a pretty popular topic. The webinar will feature Rick O'Connell, a recognized leader in renewable energy technology and policy. Rick is the Executive Director of GridLab, an organization that provides technical grid expertise to enhance policy decision-making and to help ensure a rapid transition to a reliable, cost-effective, and low-carbon future. Rick has provided engineering support for more than 8 gigawatts of utility-scale solar projects worldwide, including several of the largest projects in the world. Prior to GridLab, Rick was at Black Veatch for 12 years, where he was instrumental in building the global renewable energy consulting practice. Rick also serves as a director on the board of ESIG. I feel very fortunate to have Rick here with us today. On a personal note, as I've gotten in the habit of doing, I took a look on LinkedIn last night and found that Rick and I have 93 shared connections. I consider Rick a good friend, and I greatly value the contributions that he makes to ESIG and the board. It's a real pleasure working with him. The purpose of the webinar today is to take a look at the ability of smart inverters to contribute to voltage regulation. The webinar is based on a recent GridLab paper, which aims to inform utilities, developers, and state regulators of the voltage regulation options available under the new IEEE standards, and makes recommendations based on the experience of states and utilities that have deployed early versions of smart inverters. Commercial versions of the new smart inverters, based on the IEEE 1547-2018 standard, are expected to be available in 12 to 18 months. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And Rick, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Charlie. That was a very warm welcome. I really appreciate the introduction. And I absolutely enjoy working with you. I've been known Charlie for many years, so I'm happy to be here. So I think Charlie gave a great introduction, but I just want to briefly mention, if for folks who aren't aware of GridLab, we're a national nonprofit that provides grid expertise to advocates and policymakers and others on both the distribution system and the bulk system. And we've been working for the last several years across the country, done a lot of cool projects, and do occasionally collaborate with ESIG. So I'm excited to be here. So I think Charlie gave a good introduction. Let me just tell you what I'm going to talk about today and why we're here. So I'm going to give a little bit of context. I'm going to talk about the background. Charlie mentioned the new IEEE 1547. Talk a little bit about experience of states like California and Hawaii that have done early deployments of smart inverters, and then talk about our recommendations. This is all, this webinar, as Charlie mentioned, is all based on a paper that GridLab wrote a couple months ago. It's up on our website, gridlab.org. And I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't mention my co-authors. I drew the short straw here, and so I'm going to be the one that you're going to hear from. But Kurt Volkman and Paul Brookie, it was really the three of us, pretty collaborative writing this paper. And I also want to really thank our reviewers. So we had a group of diverse reviewers who provided really good input, thoughtful review. We actually did some pretty major revisions based on their input. So that was Brian Liddick at IREC, Andy Hoke and David Narang at NRAL, Patrick Dalton from Excel, and now ICF Consulting, and Steve Rimshaw from Sunrun. So thanks to all those folks. But I will say that anything that you're upset about, you can blame me and not the reviewers, for sure. So let's start by just diving into the context. As Charlie mentioned, why are we talking about distribution connected smart inverters? Well, the answer is that they're coming, right? And so I think a lot of folks know the context, right, as the earlier versions of 1547 were really designed for a time when we thought DER were going to be a small portion of the world, and that we wanted them essentially to shut off and not continue to generate when there were any kind of issues on the distribution grid, as well as not provide any kind of voltage regulation. And, I think in the sort of early 2010s, the Smart Inverter Working Group in California started up and really started thinking about how we were going to deploy inverters with a little bit more intelligence now that we were moving to higher penetrations of DER, and that really we need to make sure that DER were going to be good grid citizens and do a lot of the things that we ask inverter-based resources to do on the bulk grid, right? So ride through faults, ride through frequency, voltage issues, and provide just sort of better support to the bulk grid. And for those who are not aware, but you should be aware, I think NERC, it's currently out for review and should wrap up and get published here shortly, but NERC has done a really great job of publishing a paper on the impacts of 1547 on the bulk grid and setting some guidelines really around those ride-through settings. But here today, what I'm focused on is really on voltage. That's really focused on the distribution system. And so we're not really talking about bulk impacts of distribution smart inverters. We're really just focused on voltage and the distribution system. So why now? Why are we talking about this now? Well, as Charlie mentioned, the standard was finalized in April of 2018. The testing standard .1 just finalized, and so we hopefully will see equipment sort of arriving that's 1547 compliant and UL 1741 compliant in about the next year. And so, I think states are kind of preparing for this availability of this new equipment and are now setting standards now. And they actually have to, we have to think about this, right? Because it's not like we can just say, oh, we're just going to adopt this new standard. I mean, remember 1547 is an equipment capability specification, right? It says this equipment can do all these things, but it's not an interconnection standard. It doesn't say it will do X, Y, or Z. It just says it can do X, Y, and Z. And so why are we focused on voltage? Why did we write this paper on voltage and why are we here today at this webinar is because we think voltage is really contested. So the NERC guidelines and the great work that folks at EPRI and others like PJM and MISO and other places are doing around the ride-through standards, I think are pretty uncontroversial, right? There's not a lot of disagreement about what the ride-through settings should be for distribution and connected smart inverters. But voltage is a little bit more contested. And, Kurt Volkman and I specifically were involved in a smart inverter docket in Illinois, where the utilities there were doing an early deployment of smart inverters. And it was clear that there was some misinformation around voltage support from smart inverters. And it was also one of the more contested issues. So we wanted to sort of focus on that and try and get some lessons learned from these early places out into the world. So states making decisions in the future are going to, hopefully be able to learn from what other places are doing. And then, another important reason for driving this work is we really want to harmonize as much as possible the deployment of smart inverters. So an outcome that we're concerned with is that if every utility in the country wants to tweak and have a slightly different implementation of certain things, it's going to be hard to keep track of all of those settings. It's going to be hard for installers and manufacturers to make that happen. Now, I know EPRI has done some really great work here, setting up manufacturer automated profiles and making this a little bit more automated. So I commend them for that work. But we still, I think as much as possible, especially for mass market systems, want to try and standardize and not try and avoid the engineer in all of us to sort of tweak and perfect and optimize and maybe just get to something that works for most systems most of the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to the recommendation section. So, and sort of following on to that, another thing that we want to think about is communications. And so I think a lot of utilities are coming at 1547 and saying, Rule 1547 includes the capability for communications to these smart inverters. And a lot of utilities are saying, well, we'll just deploy these inverters without any kind of voltage regulation, and then we'll hook them up to our system, and then we'll send them, we'll decide what the best voltage profile is, and then we'll send it to the inverters, and that may change, each year or seasonally, when we may update them from time to time. I think we were not necessarily convinced that the sort of cost and complexity of communications really made sense for a lot of mass market systems, especially if you were just going to use the communications, fairly infrequently to kind of update, voltage profiles. We think that for most systems, typical voltage regulation profile might be absolutely appropriate. And maybe for some systems you might want a little bit more granularity, but we really also kind of think that doesn't necessarily make sense. The cost benefit doesn't outweigh for communications. And so what we're really trying to do with this paper is try and sort of find common ground, right? I mean, we see on one side, developers are nervous about asking equipment to do anything to sort of support grid requirements if that's going to potentially reduce revenue or potentially reduce production. And utilities are sort of, really want these devices to do as much as possible. And we want to kind of come in between and really think about, what should these devices be doing as kind of a good citizen, but what's maybe not appropriate to ask them to do. So that was kind of the perspective that we came in when we were writing this paper. So I think that's plenty of context. And so as I mentioned earlier, early versions of IEEE 1547 really saw DERs as being a niche on the grid, and these DERs were not allowed to provide voltage regulation, and And I think that that's, changed a little bit over time. But, most of the inverters installed up to date, with the exception of the ones we'll talk about in California and Hawaii, really have just been operating at unity power factor. And that, and that can cause problems on distribution circuits. So that can mean voltage rise. That can mean that utilities sort of struggle to maintain voltage on circuits, and that also increases the complexity of adding additional DERs if the voltage on the circuit is hard to manage. So we, one of the driving reasons for installing smart inverters and giving them the opportunity to mitigate their own voltage impacts on the circuit was really to allow DERs to kind of help mitigate their own voltage impacts, and then also make it easier for utilities to manage these voltage impacts. So obviously utilities have been managing voltage on distribution circuits for decades. They've been doing it quite well. They've got a host of tools like load tap changers and cap banks and all sorts of stuff to manage voltage. But now they're getting sort of new things, right? So now customers are installing equipment that also may affect voltage. And really, we were thinking from a focus of kind of the good grid citizen approach of how can smart inverters manage and limit their own voltage impacts. So 1547, the new version of 1547 has 4 voltage management modes plus an extra addition. So you get to choose one of these 4 modes. You can't have them, you're not allowed to run multiple modes, but then you can also add on volt watt. So these 4 modes are constant power factor. This is the default mode set to unity. So this is, you can set the device to run at like 0.95 leading or 0.95 lagging. You have volt var, which I'll talk a little bit more about. That's voltage reactive power. You have active power, reactive power, or watt var, and constant reactive power. Really, the first 2 are the ones that we're going to focus on. Those are the ones that people are most interested in. Watt var and constant reactive power aren't really used as much. We don't really think they're necessarily appropriate for mass market systems. And then I'll talk a little bit more also about volt watt. So I'm going to dig further into these. So first, let's talk about volt var. So I'm showing the voltage curve here, and this is the standard. This is the category B volt var setting for IEEE 1547. So one of the great things about volt var is it's dynamic's not the right word, but sort of it responds to the voltage on the circuit. So the smart inverter, based on what the voltage is doing on the circuit, will either be absorbing or generating reactive power to try and help either increase or decrease the voltage on the circuit. And so you can see that there's a dead band, between 98% and 102% of nominal voltage. The inverter isn't going to do anything with reactive power, but above that, it's going to start either producing or absorbing reactive power up to 44% of its capabilities, about 0.9 power factor, until it hits either 92% or 108%, at which point it's not going to keep increasing its reactive power. So it has some limits, right? And so this is, the sort of the pros here is it can respond to the voltage that's happening on the circuit, and it can either deal with high or low voltages. The negative here, though, is if the inverter doesn't have headroom and it's running at if it's putting out at maximum power output, it may end up having to curtail if it's also being asked to put out a lot of reactive power. And we also, there's been some concern by utilities and others that this may also impact sort of traditional voltage management, either other volt var controls or traditional voltage voltage devices. So there's been some concern that having your DERs try and do voltage control might confuse your traditional voltage management. So the other two modes we'll talk about briefly is constant power factor, which I talked about before. So that's a pretty simple, straightforward setting. You know, I like this setting in some ways, right? Because you can sort of set the device to essentially run all the time at a certain power factor. You know, there's been a lot of good studies, probably about 5-6 years ago, like STG&E ran a bunch of studies looking at sort of volt-var versus constant power factor. Really the downside with constant power factor is that it really only works in one direction. So you either have to set it to leading or lagging. Generally, you're going to absorb reactive power. But the other issue is that it's going to be running in that mode all the time, even when it's not needed. So even if there's not a voltage issue on the circuit, it's still going to be using reactive power. So it's going to be using reactive power all the time, which does put wear on the inverters. And then the other voltage management mode is called volt-watt. This is actually actively curtailing real power output when voltage gets high. So this is a pretty blunt instrument, really, that just makes the inverter curtail its own output if the voltage hits a certain limit, and it's on a curve, it's on a ramp down. The advantage of using this is really from a hosting capacity perspective. If I'm a distribution planner and I run some power flow analyses and look at my circuit, and I know that I'm going to have some voltage constraints, right, which is mostly what limits hosting capacity, or the amount of DERs I'm able to get on that circuit. Enabling volt-watt may sort of reduce those concerns around those voltage constraints, especially if I'm reconfiguring my circuits, right? So if I have a situation where I have to dynamically reconfigure the circuit, and now all of a sudden I have a much smaller circuit with a lot more generation on it than it normally has, the voltage goes up, the smart inverters can simply curtail themselves and hopefully bring that voltage back down. Obviously, the downside of volt-watt is pretty straightforward. It's now I'm going to have the opportunity for potentially significant real power curtailment. So this is one of the concerns we have with volt-watt. So what have we learned? And I think this was, I think this is an important part of the paper, is we tried to really consolidate a lot of really great studies that folks at NREL, HECO, a lot of the California utilities. So, both California and Hawaii have been running with smart inverters for several years now. So we've got a lot of good experience in the field with how smart inverters work in real time. They've been using the 1741 SA standard. In California, it's Rule 21. In Hawaii, I think it's Rule 14H. And so we really wanted to look at some of the sort of concerns that folks have raised about these different approaches, like volt-var and volt-watt. And so some of the things that a lot of folks are concerned about is, does volt-var really affect output? So if I'm asked to turn on volt-var regulation and help regulate and mitigate voltage impacts on the distribution circuits, is that going to mean that I'm going to lose real power production? So for you to lose real power, two things would have to happen, right? You need to be running at high voltage, and you need to be running at full output. Because if you're not running at full output, you have headroom in the inverter to produce reactive power. So I think NREL did a lot of work at HECO where, we have some of the most stressed distribution systems, and we think real power is in losses in the range of about 0.5% in some of the during high voltage periods. And so on an annual basis, it's even going to be less than that. And I know a lot of folks on the utility world may say, well, that's a very small number, it doesn't really matter. Obviously, if you're a solar developer, like a small percentage of production can mean a lot in terms of the difference between a good project and a bad project. But we think that there's ways to sort of, so number one, we're pretty convinced that the potential losses from volt-VAR are very small, and that there's relatively straightforward ways to mitigate those losses. And that's, one is by having headroom, so you can have an inverter that has a little bit of extra kVAR capacity, so it can be rated at, let's say, 0.9 power factor for full output. So that's pretty typical in the utility scale world, where you'll have inverters that are rated at 0.9 power factor. So that's something that we may want to start thinking about doing in the distribution side as well. So the other concern we had was that there's would volt-VAR conflict with traditional voltage management devices, or would it conflict with conservation voltage devices or newer integrated volt-VAR control? We thought this was a really good question, and in fact, in the Illinois docket that I mentioned, the Illinois Smart Inverter docket, the Illinois Commission actually asked Ameren and ComEd to study this particular issue, if enabling volt-VAR on DERs was going to impact their voltage optimization programs. And PG&E and HECO also did a bunch of studies with NREL on this. And the takeaway from all of these studies was essentially no. It doesn't seem like volt-VAR has any kind of impact on traditional voltage regulation or volt-VAR. So I think we're pretty comfortable that the literature supports this. So next, we wanted to actually make recommendations, which is tough for engineers, right? We always like to say, well, on one hand, and then on the other hand. But in this case, again, coming back to what I was talking about earlier, when we were talking about, we're really focused here on mass market systems. So I'm grateful to Jens Bomer and others at EPRI who put together this really useful kind of pyramid of systems. And what this pyramid is really showing, and I think this is important, is at the bottom we have sort of the default values for the state, like the standard values for the state, and most DERs are going to be able to adopt those standard values. So those are the standard settings for ride-through, as well as recommended settings for voltage regulation. And most DERs are going to be able to adopt those because, most DERs are small. Maybe they go through the interconnection process. They get fast-tracked. There's no impact. They're on a feeder with no other DERs. Whatever the issue is, we think that for most DERs, you'll be able to adopt the standard and then harmonize settings. And there maybe there's some utility-specific issues. So a specific utility in a state has some specific technology that they've deployed, and they want to kind of tweak that standard setting for their system. And so maybe that's the next layer, right? Well, many DERs are going to have some specific setting that helps that distribution utility manage their system better. But then, of course, we're always going to have, there's going to be a handful of projects. These are going to be maybe larger projects, projects that are over 500 kilowatts or a megawatt, or the projects that are in a specific constrained area. And they may need very specific settings. They may need communications, and that's going to come out of the interconnection study. And that's really not, that's not much different on how we do things in the bulk grid. So I just want to be really clear that our recommendations are for the bottom of the pyramid, right? So we're talking about what makes sense for most systems. Obviously, everyone's going to say, well, people have said to us, well, that's not going to work for my system. I've got this system that is at the end of a rural feeder and it's, 5 megawatts or whatever. Of course, we understand that. But we're really focused on the most DERs, kind of the bottom of the pyramid, and hoping to harmonize settings. So our recommendation, surprise, surprise, is that volt-VAR is the preferred voltage regulation mode. We think it manages voltage using the least amount of reactive power. We don't see that it conflicts with other forms of voltage management. And then I think something else that's important, I think there's some utilities that we've heard are saying, well, we don't want to implement that now. We don't really know what we want now. So we're going to deploy smart inverters at Unity, running at Unity at fixed power factor. And when we figure it out later, we'll come back and we'll make them install communications, and then we'll set it to something else. And we really believe that these settings are a way to sort of future-proof. You don't want to have to go back later and fix legacy smart inverters because you're not ready with exactly the perfect setting. And we think that the default curve, we're recommending the default category B volt var curve from 1547 standard, reduces confusion, works for most systems most of the time. So even if you're a utility with very low penetrations or a state with very low penetrations of DER, it makes sense to turn this on because it's not going to impact production. If voltages aren't moving much, it's not actually going to be producing or absorbing any reactive power. So we think this is a way to really future-proof and leverage the power we have in these smart inverters. And then we would think from developers and customers should be thinking about maybe adding headroom into inverters to reduce potential real power loss. And then the corollary to that is just to make sure that utilities are not overly restricting their interconnection requirements to say, oh, well, you're installing a 1.1 kVA inverter, but you said it's 1 kilowatt. And yes, that extra kVA is potentially for reactive power. So I think that's important that the interconnection process allow headroom in the inverters. So I think that, we think volt var is a pretty uncontroversial recommendation. And I think the second recommendation, volt watt, is going to be a little bit more controversial because I think this has some real concerns, especially from the developer and customer of potential impact for curtailment. But we really think that if you're going to implement volt watt, that you would start to curtail you would only really do real power curtailment after 1.06 per unit. So that's outside the ANSI range. So you would be rarely doing this, right? So you'd only really be curtailing if the voltage gets outside of the ANSI range. I think that's pretty important because that doesn't happen very often, and utilities have an obligation to really keep voltages on the distribution circuit within the ANSI range. But why are we recommending this? Why are we recommending volt watt? And we really think that this kind of provides this backstop for high voltage events. So it gives comfort to utility planners that they're able to increase the hosting capacity of these circuits, get more DERs on these circuits, knowing that they have this backstop so that if something goes wrong because there's the circuit gets reconfigured, some load drops off or some DER trips off and increases the voltage, that these devices are going to sort of autonomously do what's necessary to kind of bring the voltage back into line. And we think it also sort of eliminates the need for direct control because I think a lot of utilities think, well, the only way I can be certain about the voltage of these DERs if I have control of over the devices. And and we do have some experience from HECO from some pilots. Also, my understanding is that HECO has an option where you can sign up for volt watt. And NREL has done some good modeling, and so we're in debt to them for their work on this. That really the curtailment from volt watt is pretty minimal if the curve is set outside the NC range. But I think that's also there's still a concern for some people saying, well, what if I'm in just a bad section of the circuit? I'm in a bad place. I'm right next to a substation where the voltage may go high more often than not. And I think we really need, if states are going to make this recommendation for smart inverters, you need to make sure that there's good reporting and there's good vigilance around voltage issues so that customers who get stuck in a situation that the utility has an obligation to remedy that and fix a consistent overvoltage issue. So that's our recommendation on volt watt. And that's actually, all I had on the slides. I see that there's a flood of questions coming in, so I'll try and address those. I specifically wanted to make this presentation short so I could, because I knew there was going to be lots of questions. So let's go ahead and Charlie, did you want to read the questions?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go through them so that everybody can hear them. So the first question we have here is, can you explain a settings profile versus an installer adjusting a setting to a utility's requirement? Is there an IEEE 1547-like profile in current UL 1741 SA certifying inverters?
So, Michelle, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to the 1741 SA question. I'm sure there's people on this call that know the answer. But there is the difference between a settings profile versus an installer adjusting settings. So what EPRI is doing that I mentioned, and this is really just, you can go and reach out to EPRI and get more information on this, but they're, utilities would create a utility requirements profile that could then an installer would download that and it would program the inverter. And that's much more secure than having an installer go through an LCD screen and trying to set individual settings on ride through, because these settings can be quite complicated. And what we don't want is, the opportunity for mistakes at the installation where there's a complex configuration you have to do with this inverter. We want to be able to download a profile. And so that's what the settings profile is versus an installer, physically trying to program the inverter at installation time. So kudos to EPRI for thinking about that and sort of being able to streamline that.
Greg, going back to your comment about communications, can you talk about the communications requirement to do the download?
Yeah, that's I haven't thought about that. I'm not sure if that's something that would require communications at the installation time, or if that's something that could be sort of downloaded from a PC onto the. That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to communications.
Right.
So, in the voltage control mode, you mentioned that there may be a challenge with traditional voltage management. Could you explain a bit more about the challenge? I think you covered that in one of your slides, but maybe just re-emphasize the point.
Right, and I think here it's really just utilities are, the utilities are used to having voltage control devices that are on the circuit that they control that are, and what they were worried about is if you have autonomous devices that are also trying to regulate the voltage, that those two may have adverse interactions. And I think we can, the paper is pretty short, and there's great footnotes where we actually, point you to the papers that sort of talk about that. And I would also say that, like I said, both Ameren and ComEd did nice big studies that you're welcome to dig into to look where they really went into detail and tried to see what those impacts would be.
Okay. You mentioned that volt var will not affect traditional voltage regulation, but will one large solar installation with volt var voltage management affect another large solar installation with volt var or another voltage management? Any experience or feedback on that one?
Yeah, again, that's a good question, and that's where I sort of think that we're really focused. Yeah, there could be potential interactions there, especially if you're talking about, sort of two large systems on the same circuit. And that's where I think I'd sort of fall back and say, hey, we're really focused here on smaller systems and, more mass market systems. And if you to get to that level, if they are larger systems, you might want to have them, especially if they're sharing a circuit with another large system. At that point, you probably might want to have more customized settings for those devices.
Yeah, maybe more the domain for an interconnection study.
Correct.
Okay, on the recommended volt var, how can optimal headroom be determined to minimize the impact of power loss? Take a look at that.
Sure. So where is this power loss coming from? So, grid following inverters are current limited devices. And so if you're at maximum power out, if you're let's say you're a very small 1 kVA inverter and you're at maximum power output at unity power factor, you're current limited. And if now all of a sudden you're now told that you need to be producing some reactive power, you're going to actually have to curtail real power to produce that reactive power. And then in terms of what should the optimal headroom be, I think it's a pretty straightforward recommendation that, ideally you'd get an inverter that could produce at maximum power at 0.9 power factor. And that's pretty standard in the bulk system. And on the distribution system, that would let you essentially be at max Q output, max reactive power output, and still being at max real power output. So I think that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Here's an interesting question from Professor Simonelli. Hi, John. Talking about the voltage regulation devices, while they may not have a negative impact, they will require a much higher level of voltage coordination to make sure all of them are working in concert rather than fighting each other. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, John, I guess I would just sort of similar answer as to going back to I'm not going to have like a perfect answer on that, but, we all sort of thought that was the issue, that turning on volt var on these devices, they were going to end up fighting with other voltage management. It just doesn't appear that that's the case. Now, specific utilities may have different equipment that hasn't looked at this and may cause problems, but, all the stuff that we've looked at and that folks have looked at have said that that's not really the case. They're not going to fight each other.
Okay. Question here. Do your thoughts on voltage control change if the situation is not a single DER inverter, but a behind-the-meter microgrid that may comprise multiple PV inverters, a wind turbine, energy storage inverters, for example?
Oh, that's a great question, one that I haven't really thought of. But if you think about a behind-the-meter microgrid, there's still a single, point of interconnection with the distribution system, and that's what we're most interested in. And a microgrid, if it's in island mode, obviously it's not impacting the distribution system, and we're not addressing, voltage regulation inside microgrids. If it isn't in island mode, then all of those devices are going to be, on the circuit. So I think we probably a good question. That's a relatively corner case. I would think that you might want to have different settings for a microgrid, because when it's islanded, you may want different settings than when you want when it's unislanded, connected to the distribution system.
Okay, here's a couple of comments from Hawaii.
Yep.
I'm sure they're questions, but maybe you just want to react to them. I'm having trouble with my box here.
Right. Is this the question from Mark Matsuura?
Mark Matsuura, yeah.
Yeah, Mark, that's great. I think I appreciate you bringing this up. I think I should have been clear in the presentation. That
let me just read the comment for the benefit of the listeners. I think
apologies.
The % curtailment was at a very high penetration level in the model. I think in the range of 600% generation to load. While there may be some curtailment, without the volt var capability, PV systems would not be interconnected or would trip off. That was the comment.
Right, and then Mark goes on to say that the use of volt watt is helpful to ramp down output just before the system would trip anyway. And so
Right.
I think that those are two excellent points that, thank you, Mark, for bringing that up, because I should have brought that up when I gave the presentation. So I should have been clear that 0.5% curtailment that we saw from VoltVar was a worst case, as Mark makes a very good point. That's a kind of a worst case. So that's in a very heavily loaded Hawaiian system with a lot of generation compared to load. And so, and Mark's point is that if those systems were kind of legacy systems at Unity, they probably would have just tripped off. And his point about volt watt is also another very good one, which is one of the things that is a positive for volt watt for everybody is that if you didn't enable volt watt and the voltage did get out of the NC range, eventually these systems might actually just trip offline because the voltage has gone too high. And now your DER is completely offline and may, take some time to reconnect. You may absolutely prefer that it sort of ramps down, sort of self-curtails for a few minutes until the voltage issue is resolved and then comes back online, as opposed to completely tripping offline. So I think, Mark, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point, and one of the reasons why we wanted to recommend volt watt.
Okay. Question here on Headroom. Why do you need Headroom if the inverters can curtail their active power to provide reactive power? The Q priority control logic exists in utility-scale PV plants.
Yep. Well, that's correct. I mean, you need Headroom because you don't want to curtail your active power, because curtailing your active power means lost revenue, and nobody likes lost revenue.
Yeah. So another question here from Mark. Would low short circuit strength cause control stability issues and fighting between the voltage controlling systems?
Yeah, Mark, another good question, and I think going back to Johnson Manelli's question about the voltage regulation, I think if you're in a circuit with low short circuit strength, you probably would not, you would not go through the fast track interconnection, and you'd need some additional study. And so I think if you're on that circuit, you're probably going to maybe have more customized settings. And so I'm not sure that VoltVar it might be the right answer, but you'd need more study on that.
And next question is similar, Rick. For low BPS short areas, do you think there would be a difference in the DER voltage regulation settings?
Yeah, I think same answer, although I'm confused by the use of BPS there, because we're talking about the distribution. Just to be, if I wasn't clear before, we're talking about distribution interconnected. IEEE 1547 is a distribution interconnection standard, or equipment standard for distribution interconnected equipment. We have nothing to do with the bulk power system here.
Except it's a weak grid area, I think, just in general terms, of point of interconnection. Let's see. In your experience, what the presently installed smart inverters with VoltVar control do at night?
Yeah, great question. So my understanding, and folks can correct me, but my understanding is that they're not going to do anything at night. Obviously, they could, but they're really, if you go back to what I was talking about at the beginning, this is really about not necessarily using smart inverters as integrated VoltVar control, but really using smart inverters to kind of mitigate the impact of their own generation has on the distribution system. So at that point, we really only want them to be running during the day. I mean, it's a good topic, right? Like, I've thought about this a lot, but could we leverage smart inverters to do broader VoltVar control? And, it's a topic for potentially another webinar.
Okay, last question here. You noted VoltVar implementation may result in real power losses, but what about net power factor? Could high implementation of VoltVar result in average power factor measured at the feeder breaker below optimal plus minus 98%, typically desired by the utility?
I mean, potentially, I think it depends on like what voltage regulation circuits are, what voltage regulation equipment the utility has. That hasn't been utilities' experience in Hawaii and California, but that's, I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of more general questions, Rick. Just what's your view about the reaction to the changes in 1547? How is the industry viewing the new 1547 2018? And do you see a general acceptance for it? Do you see already a list of more changes that people would like to put into the next version? What's the feedback from what's out there now with the new standard?
That's a good question, Charlie. I think most of us, at least, I think I want to give credit again to EPRI for collecting, folks like NERC and IREC and GridLab and IEEE, SIA and others into kind of, this sort of loose collaboration of folks kind of trying to implement 1547 in a sane and rational way. I think most people right now are more focused on kind of the implementation of the new standard and less on, boy, I wish it had X, Y, or Z. I think your question will be a good one in about 5 years after we've kind of implemented this and then we've had some time under our belt. I think maybe one of the things, ramp rate is something that some people wanted that is in Rule 21, but that's not in the standard. But, in general, I think we're more focused in the near term of getting it implemented across the country and less on, gosh, what can we do next time? Because it's still pretty fresh. I mean, it's not even 2 years old. So it's not even potty trained yet, this standard.
Yeah. And every standard is a compromise. So everybody didn't get everything, but hopefully the stuff that got in there is going to be useful and will be well accepted and used. And a similar question on communications. I guess you mentioned equipment was required to be communications compliant. What are you seeing in terms of people using communications? Are people just kind of ignoring the communications capability for a while? Are there some DERM systems that have it, that are using it? What's going on with the communications? Any current thinking on that?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie, for the the question. This is something that I think about a lot. So as folks may or may not know, California in Rule 21 and obviously in the 1547 standard requires communications capability, but they have not yet required communications with the utility. So, smart inverters are going in with the capability to communicate with the utility, but are not currently doing so in California at, greater than 5% DER penetration. There's some, I think there's some states or some utilities that are just kind of going in with the assumption, of course, if we have this communications capability, we should use it, and that all new smart inverters should be deployed and connected, and we should communicate with them. Like I said earlier, I'm not sure that that's correct. I'm skeptical of the need to communicate with every single device, and I'm concerned about sort of the cost and I'm not sure that the benefits of being able to communicate with thousands of DERs outweigh the costs of doing that, especially when those DERs are, we call them smart inverters for a reason. They're smart. They can actually make decisions on their own based on voltage and frequency. And maybe we should limit communications to the kind of the 80-20 rule, right? I mean, 80% of the megawatts are in 20% of the systems. Maybe we should focus communications on those and leave the mass market systems to run autonomously.
Okay. That's what we get with smart inverters.
Right.
Okay, a closing question here from Michelle again. Do you have any thoughts on the state should implement Category 2 or 3 after the proposed amendment to 1547-2018 under consideration now?
I'm not aware of the amendment. I would absolutely, in this case, if you're a state making this decision, I would absolutely defer to your grid operator. So like if you're in PJM, if you're in MISO, MISO is going to give you guidance. And and should always defer to NERC, right? So, NERC, MISO, PJM are going to give you guidance on what they think the best category should be for, abnormal operation. So just to be clear, you're asking, category 2, category 3, that's, what should my voltage ride through and my frequency ride through settings be? So again, I guess I don't have a personal recommendation between category 2 or 3. I think you should defer to your, local friendly grid operator on that, whether that's PJM, MISO, or the, NERC.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good discussion for this afternoon. I think we've got through all the questions very efficiently. Rick, very good summary of the state of the art and very good replies to what's going on there. So, as I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the presentation and audio file have been posted. I also want to encourage you to send any follow-up questions to info@esig.energy, and we'll get them answered and posted as quickly as possible. We really appreciate your engagement. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on Wednesday, February 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern, which is only 2 weeks away. That webinar will feature Nick Miller, a consultant well known from his previous career with GE. It'll examine a number of considerations related to the operation of power systems with a high share of inverter-based resources. Very popular topic these days. I hope everybody will be able to join us once again. And for further information on all the webinars and meetings, you can take a look at the website at www.esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails. So Rick, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you next month with Nick Miller on the inverter-based resource webinar, or in March at the Spring Technical Workshop in Tucson. In the meantime, take care, everyone. Thanks again for your participation.